Hello everyone, today I'm going to talk about contemporary religious and spiritual dynamics among Native Alaskan individuals and groups, which is one of my favorite topics in this whole course. And you'll notice that I have it subtitled, To Bind Together Again. And you may be wondering what the heck I'm even talking about. So allow me to explain. The English word religion comes from Latin religare. You may recognize because of course it's in a million English words as a prefix, which means again, as in return, to turn again. Ligare, you may recognize the root there is the same as ligament, so it means like tie something together, kind of like your ligaments help tie your body together. And so religare means to bind together again. So our English word religion comes from the Latin idea of reuniting something or binding two things together. And when we think of two things that have been bound together in a religious context, that might sound kind of like control, right? That may bring to mind images of religion as something that is controlling of people's lives. However, it is useful to remember that we can also think of religion as something which ties and connects disparate things together, that makes things that are not united or perhaps once were united, as in many Alaska Native sacred stories, animals and humans once were, take something which were once united, have since been dissolved, and now brings them back together into a cohesion, into a binding. So that is what we're going to be talking about today, is the idea of sort of how did religion historically for Alaska Native groups unite people to each other, to the world around them, and to the world of the spirits, and how does religion, which often looks very, very different than it did, prior to colonialism, but how does religion today in Alaska Native communities bind things together? So we're going to be talking about sort of change in religious traditions over time. Now, as I use the term religion, I want to be clear about what I mean because that can bring to mind a lot of different associations for people. So I'm an anthropologist of religion, and I often make sure to explain to people on the first day of my anthropology of religion class that in anthropology, we use that term much, much broader than it's often used in everyday American English. When I say the word religion or religious in everyday American English, it's common for people to think in terms of large organized religions. Well, I always hate the term organized religions because all religions are organized in their own way, but large religious organizations. Instead, for anthropologists, religion does not just mean large religious organizations, it means any of the many, many cultural ways in which people approach the supernatural, try to appeal to or harmonize with the supernatural. And so although it's common in English, for example, in our culture nowadays for folks to say things like, I'm spiritual but not religious, we, as anthropologists, would say, well, of course we understand what you mean by that, but we would consider somebody that's not a part of an organized religion but has spiritual beliefs to also be religious. They're just not part of a religious organization. This sometimes comes up specifically with Native groups because there's some sort of question of what we should call the sacred traditions of the people. When I was first doing my research on sacred lands with Navajo people, I remember using the term religion and people telling me, well, don't use the term religion because religion's something you do once a week. Religion, for us, it was a way of life, or it is a way of life. So sometimes that was the preference, and you can sort of see that in terms of, I called Unit 2 lifeways, although I think that's a bit of a broader term. So, sometimes, again, religion can have a connotation of something very narrow. That's not what we mean as anthropologists. We really mean overall just how a culture approaches the supernatural. And this isn't a typo where I've got a dash between super and natural, because I want to kind of unpack that a little bit. When we talk about the supernatural, as anthropologists, what is considered supernatural is going to definitely vary by culture. But generally speaking, many cultures have some sense, even if it's a culture where nature itself is sacred and what you're venerating is sacred, nature, most cultures have some sense of something which goes beyond what is immediately visible, right? Some kind of hidden world, some kind of world beyond, some kind of unusual world, perhaps overlain with our own world, whether that's the Dreamtime within Aboriginal Australia, or whether that's the heaven and spirits and angels within Christianity. It can mean a lot of different things, but the idea of something that goes beyond sort of the immediately obvious natural world, even if it is actually embedded in nature, which for many of these Alaska Native sacred traditions, that's exactly what we're talking about. In many cases, we're talking about spirits embedded within nature, but still, it's sort of, things that have to do with things that are not seen, or things which may not be immediately obvious, things which might be more mystical or transcendent. So, We're taking a broad scope approach to religion then, but that's going to be the topic for today. And as we do so, as we start talking about religion, I would like you to sit back, lean back in your chair, stroke your goatee if you have one, and I want you to think, what is reality to you? What is real to you? That may be a more significant question in 2020 than it's ever been, as we live in an age where so much misinformation gets spread via social media, to the point where people consider this a very serious and ongoing concern that we have to think about from a public policy perspective. And so reality, what's reality is not always as straightforward as it seems, perhaps. And perhaps it's never been entirely, in the sense that there's a reality we all sort of exhibit and understand, right? We all sort of understand that my car, when I turn on the ignition, is not going to float away to the sky. But on the other hand, there's a lot of other aspects of reality, supernatural aspects, that people vary wildly on, or whether there even is a supernatural aspect to things. But the reason I'm having you think about reality is because I want to use a famous phrase, or at least famous to anthropologists, so, maybe 10,000 people in the whole world know it, but anyways, Clifford Geertz, a famous, well-known early anthropologist of religion, he said that religion was something that caused people to feel certain kinds of moods and motivations which were, quote, which they considered to be, quote, really real. And I've always loved that phrase, the really real. So the idea that for some people in practicing religion, they consider what they're experiencing interacting with the supernatural to be something that's, in a sense, even more real than your everyday life. It's something that's sort of this bedrock foundational thing to how you perceive yourself and how you perceive your values and how you perceive the world, right? That's not the case for all religious people. For some people, it's, fairly tangential part of their lifestyle. But for some people, it really is sort of a bedrock on which a lot of other ideas and value systems get built. And that matters when we think about cultures, right? The religion can oftentimes have a profound effect on how a culture views reality. There is traditionally, prior to modern times, there really were no non-religious cultures. All cultures had some kind of religious or spiritual tradition. Doesn't mean everybody was religious or spiritual, but all cultures had some kind of a system of supernatural approaches. Not only that, but for many cultures, and I would say many Alaska Native cultures prior to colonialism, perhaps all, religion was very much interwoven with all the other aspects of life. It was interwoven with politics. It was interwoven with kinship. So you really couldn't think of it as a separate thing, right? So when a Yupik person is honoring a prey species with a specific kind of prayer, a first salmon prayer, that is an economic activity because you want to show respect to the salmon and you want the salmon to return. So it's part of how you hunt, or rather fish in this case, but it's also every bit as much a religious activity. And it's also in a sense a cultural activity because you're sort of connecting with your ancestors by continuing on those traditions. So what I'm trying to get at here is that for many of the cultures pre-colonialism, religion A would have been widely shared among the group, right? There wouldn't have been sort of thousands of religions like what we have nowadays. People would have disagreed, of course, like any other people, but they would have been largely sharing in sort of the same general supernatural framing. And point number two, that supernatural framing would have embedded and been embedded within so many aspects of their culture. Again, that idea of a non-differentiated society. And so religion really powerfully shapes worldviews in that regard. We can think, for example, about the Degshanag reading that we did about Pike and sort of the different ways of viewing animals and the ability of animals to transform in historic or in mythic time, in sacred time, how they could transform back and forth, and how that affects Degshanag views in general of sort of nature and cosmology, as the author was pointing out. Or we could think, for example, about the reading you did about Begesh and Begesha in historic Dena'ina society, which was a practice that had to do with the idea that your material, like objects, your trash or your things or your possessions, could carry information, sometimes a negative information, like a negative scent that would cause offense to the animals or to the spirits, and therefore things like animal bones had to be very properly disposed of in the right ceremonial way, with fire, with water, depending on the case. And as a result, this is one of the many reasons why it's very difficult to find as many artifacts when we're doing archaeology here on the peninsula or other places. It's one of the reasons, most likely, that it's difficult to find artifacts in many cases. You can find Dena'ina settlements clear as day, but sometimes it can be hard to find artifacts to go with them because there was this religious worldview that was structuring how people got rid of their sort of trash. Archaeology, a lot of archaeology is digging through ancient trash, as it were. And so if you have a culture where the religion is affecting how people dispose of their trash, that actually affects, thousands or hundreds of years later, how we interpret that culture. And so religious worldviews shape things hugely in many cultures. They shape worldview. It's not the only thing that shapes worldview. If you think, for example, sort of early colonial America, it's not like it was just Christianity influencing things. It was capitalism. It was sort of the not quite emerging yet industrialism. It was Greek philosophy ideas that had percolated into Europe. For that matter, Arabic philosophy ideas that had percolated into Europe. It was the Enlightenment and the scholars from Italy and Scotland in different places. There was a lot of things going on that were influencing people's worldview in sort of early Anglo-American colonies, but definitely Christianity was one of them. And so religion powerfully shapes worldviews, which, raises, I think, an interesting question for us. And that question is this. If religion has such a powerful effect on people, on a culture's worldview, on how a culture chooses to frame itself, how it chooses to act, even how it chooses to relate to the natural world, what then are the effects when that religion is removed, or when that religion is drastically altered? Which is the exact condition that we have when we think of native Alaska, that there's been sort of dramatic changes. So to explain that, I'm going to jump forward in the slides and then I'll go back to those other ones. If you think about the religious demographics of Alaska Native people, obviously that's a typo there, I apologize. Let me fix that. This is Pew Center data. It's a few years old, but I think it's relatively current. 79% of Alaska Native people were self-identifying as Christian. Now, of course, this could be varying degrees of Christian, and as we'll talk about in a bit, Christian doesn't mean you're not also practicing other things, but 79% identifying as Christian. A little under 5% identifying as other world religions, such as approximately 1% identifying as Jewish, approximately a half a percentage identifying as Muslim, about a half a percentage identifying as Hindu, and so forth. And then you have about 17% of the population, and these numbers aren't perfectly adding up to 100, partly because we're rounding, who identify on the survey as unaffiliated. Now, unaffiliated is a tricky number because unaffiliated is sort of a catch-all category that we use when we're doing surveys of religion, but it can refer to a lot of different things. It can refer to people that are atheists who are not affiliated with religion. It can refer to people that are agnostic. It can refer to people that might call themselves sort of spiritual but not religious. It might refer also to Alaska Native people that are practitioners of traditional lifeways, such as Yupik shamanism, but don't choose to identify such as survey, or don't kind of feel like there's a box to check, so to speak, on the survey, and so just sort of say like, well, none of these options, right? And so that may as much reflect the limitations of the survey as it does the actual religious identity of the people. So we could assume that at least a small percentage, if not a somewhat large percentage of these, are folks that are sort of doing a lot of practicing of their traditional lifeways. But nonetheless, what we see is that a huge percentage, 80% plus, of Alaska Native people identify as one of the large world religions, primarily Christian. So that's pretty interesting when you consider it from a perspective of culture change, when you consider the fact that Christianity within Alaska is really only 250, give or take, years old since the entrance of Russian missionaries into Alaska. And really for many parts of Alaska, much of the interior, for example, it's even newer than that, really kind of the early 1900s. And so this has been a rapid change. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about sort of how that change happened, what the effects of that change were, and sort of a little bit about what that looks like today. Because to say that Alaska Native people are predominantly Christian, well, that can look really different in different Alaska Native communities. It's simplistic to just sort of paint it all with one broad brush, which, by the way, on that note, we could actually further kind of break down that 79% number and point out that about 47% of Alaska Native people identify as one of the Protestant traditions, which is itself a really broad category, but so we could further break it down as, 26% of Alaska Native people are evangelical in identification, 19% are mainline Protestant, which if you're not familiar with that term, that would be groups such as Methodist, Episcopalian, Presbyterian, and so forth. 2% identify with what are called on surveys one of the Black Protestant traditions, such as AME, for example, African Methodist Episcopal. 14% of Alaska Native people identify as Roman Catholic. 12.5% identify as Russian Orthodox. So a very, very large percentage relative really to any other part of the United States are Russian Orthodox, for a fairly obvious reason that Russian Orthodoxy was the first form of Christianity, really, for all intents and purposes, to be introduced into Alaska. 4% identify as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or more popularly known as Mormon. Or sorry, not more properly known by a nickname, Mormon. Less than 0.5% identify as Jehovah's Witness or other Christian groups that don't fit into those above categories. So that's interesting. That's really interesting. And we have to ask ourselves sort of how that happened, how it got to be that case, why did certain groups become predominant, and also sort of what that looks like for folks today. Now, you'll notice, by the way, as I was talking, that I kept saying, identify as. There's a couple of reasons why I do that. One of the reasons I do that is because somebody might tell a surveyor that they are a such and such religion, but they may or may not be very actively involved in the religion, or may not really super believe in the religion. It depends. So that's one reason. Another reason is because we don't want to, when we talk about surveys, especially surveys of faraway, remote, rural communities that may or may not in some communities have things like reliable internet access, maybe dealing with sort of cell phone issues or telephone line issues, different things, we want to be a little hesitant when we draw too sharp of conclusions from surveys like that. When you're dealing with small numbers spread over big areas with technological impediments to surveying, we want to be a little cautious. But that's at least kind of a ballpark, and the ballpark is basically a whole lot of Alaska Native people nowadays are Christian, and a surprising percentage belonging to certain groups that have historically been predominant. So again, this lecture will kind of dive a little bit more into that.